We've all been playing Dungeons & Dragons wrong, at least according to Wizards of the Coast. In order for just about anything to work, there needs to be a few baseline assumptions made about that thing's state of operation. If you're building a road, that road should go somewhere. If you're cooking dinner, someone is probably going to eat it. If your fantasy-based tabletop role-playing game has swords and magic, the characters in it are probably going to be using them. Dungeons & Dragons is not unique in that respect. This is a fundamental principle that underpins the design of just about everything. The funny thing about those assumptions, though, is that they don't actually need to be true. That dinner you cooked could have been a practice meal for your restaurant, or maybe it got messed up during preparation. That road you're building doesn't actually have to go anywhere in particular either. Maybe it's a drag strip, or it was a miscalculation during planning, but it might get turned into a bigger project somewhere down the line. Those swords and magic, maybe they are getting used, but just not quite as much as anticipated. These assumptions, though, whether they are true or not, or even if they are partially true but just not completely accurate, can often persist long past the point they were expected to, and create some unexpected issues along the way. If it wasn't already clear, the thing that I'm not particularly subtly referring to is Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition's conceptualization of the adventuring day. It's definitely worth noting that timekeeping during campaigns and its importance is nothing new to D&D. Far from it. The time in a campaign section from the 1st edition AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide really emphasizes just how important it was. Here's a quote: "Game time is of the utmost importance. Failure to keep track of time expenditure by player characters will result in many anomalies in the game. The stricture of time is what makes recovery of hit points meaningful." It continues with probably my favorite part, since it was actually written in all caps, and reads, "You cannot have a meaningful campaign if strict time records are not kept." The reason I find this so important to mention early on is that it truly emphasizes the point that I made right at the beginning of the video, which is that time in Dungeons & Dragons is a fundamental assumption of the game. It wasn't something that was tacked on to be kind of interesting depending on the type of game you're playing, and it certainly wasn't an afterthought or something that was only brought about in recent editions. On Thursday, January 25th, I'm going to be running a 1D&D one-shot with Colby from D4, Chris from Treant Monk's Temple, and Pack Tactics, and I'm hoping it can kind of double as a 5,000 subscriber celebration event. So if you liked what I do and would like to help support me reaching that goal, a sub to the channel would be incredibly appreciated. Thank you. The importance of timekeeping not only goes back to 1st edition, but actually original D&D, and has been carried forward all the way to the modern day in 5th edition and 1D&D, and will almost certainly continue to be important in an eventual 6th edition too. What really gets me is just how crucial the concept of time was, to the point that they essentially write off any campaign that dares not focus intently on it. You cannot have a meaningful campaign if strict time records are not kept. They wrote it in all caps. Now, it is certainly worth mentioning here that AD&D does play very differently than the modern game, but that still doesn't make this assumption any less valid today. This then begs the question of what exactly a meaningful campaign is. I think that this is a really difficult question to answer, but is also core to deciphering the intent behind the current adventuring day. Like I've mentioned in so many other videos before, Dungeons & Dragons is an extremely multifaceted game that can be enjoyed by all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons. Whether you're in it for the story or the world building or combat or character building or social interaction or even just to hang out with your friends, everyone will have something personal to them that makes the game meaningful to them. And though I don't particularly like to use this term, I think what the original designers had in mind when they conceptualized the idea of a meaningful campaign was more in objective terms than we probably view things today. Now, the concept of objectivity in a game that largely exists in our collective imaginations is complicated. I have to imagine that the original designer's belief of a meaningful campaign is one that had meaningful choice. One where the things that you do matter. They have impacts on the world around you. One where you could miss a monster in its lair because it was out wreaking havoc in some other area of the world. One where the treasure that you were after had just been discovered by a rivaling adventuring party just a few days prior, so you didn't actually get what you came for. One where your group needs to truly decide if the time spent resting and getting their hit points and spells back is more valuable than continuing to push forward for just that little bit longer. Obviously, all of these things can be and are largely still true today. The point of this list wasn't to say that those things were important in 1st edition and aren't now, but rather to contextualize what a quote-unquote meaningful campaign means and how that relates to our discussion of the adventuring day. I promise, I'm actually getting somewhere with all of this. Chapter 3 of the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide tells us that a typical adventuring party should be expected to be able to sustain 6 to 8 medium to hard encounters per day with 2 short rests per day, one approximately a third of the way through, and the second at approximately 2/3 of the way through. Potentially more encounters if they're easier, or fewer if the encounters are a little bit harder. Regardless though, this sets the design team's expectation for a typical adventuring day to be between 6 and 8 encounters. And because I know someone is going to bring it up, no, encounters does not exclusively mean combat, but rather anything that is designed to be resource draining in one way or another, even if it doesn't end up doing that. These can be social interactions, some sort of environmental encounters, chases, investigations. There's tons of ways that it can go that don't actually involve combat. Now, while the 5e DMG doesn't mention anything specific about time being critical to having a meaningful campaign, these numbers, they still mean something. They aren't arbitrary. If we zoom out a little bit, we can pretty safely say that the design team balanced the game around your group engaging with this many encounters per adventuring day. This means that essentially every system that we interact with in the game was built upon this assumption, there's that word again, that a typical party will be hit with between 6 and 8 medium or hard encounters every single day. This has some massive impacts. I'm not going to say catastrophic or anything that dramatic because the game obviously still functions very well regardless. But what it does mean is that the way that most players were likely playing is not how the design team intended, which can significantly skew player experiences and perceptions of the various systems in the game. So how do I know that most tables aren't actually running this many encounters per day? In all honesty, I don't. It's been something of a strong hunch of mine based off of the games that I've been running for years, the many live streams that I've seen, friends who have played, and other discussions here on YouTube. A few days ago, I did run a poll on my channel to see how many resource draining encounters your party will typically see in an adventuring day, and the overwhelming majority of you, sitting at 71% of the 360 votes at the time of writing, indicated that you see between 2 and 3 encounters per day. That's a massive result. Also, 17% indicated that a typical adventuring day for their party has them seeing between 0 and 1 encounters per day. If we put these together, that has 88% of our respondents engaging in 3 or fewer encounters per day. That is half of the low-end estimate that the design team provides in the DMG. So what can we actually gather from this? Firstly, yes, the sample size is very small, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that my tiny YouTube poll is like some Harvard peer-reviewed study. As I mentioned, only 360 votes at the time of writing, but I would argue that the poll isn't meaningless either. The people watching me or really even seeking out any additional D&D content on YouTube tend to be the types of people who are very into and committed to the game. These are more likely to be veteran players, or even if they are new players, they're new players who have taken the initiative to get actively involved in the community, which says something about the type of player that they are. If this high a proportion of my respondents, people who tend to be more serious about the game, are engaging in half or less than the expected amount of encounters in a given day, I don't think it would be unreasonable to extrapolate those numbers more broadly to assume that it's probably not all that far off the typical table. Honestly, if I had to guess, I would put the average table probably in the mid-90s for having 3 or fewer encounters. That is obviously pure speculation though. One interesting piece of context that a few commenters mention is that a typical adventuring day looks very different depending on the scenario that they're in. Dungeon crawls tended to skew toward more encounters, while overland travel or exploration yielded fewer. I think this kind of makes sense, but even they seem to agree upon the 2 to 3 number being a reasonable average across most scenarios. For my games, I would also fall into that 2 to 3 range. While I've certainly run a few adventuring days with more and some with less, this does seem to be the sweet spot for my group as well. I've thought a lot about the reason why this might be the case, and I think it largely comes down to pacing. We all want to have fun and interesting things to do and challenges to overcome, but at the end of the day, the 5 of us set aside maybe 3 hours a week from our busy lives with jobs and kids to play make-believe, and we want to feel like we are making progress. We want to actually get somewhere. If I were running 6 to 8 encounters per day, my 3.5-year long campaign that I've been running would probably be less than half as far as we are now. Obviously, every table and DM has the leeway to run their game as they see fit, but we're talking about generalities here and what expectation the designers are trying to set. You can and should do what's right for your group. I do want to give a big shout out to the 3% of people who are apparently actually running 6+ encounters per day on average though. That is wild. I mean, no disrespect. I would love to get an idea of what your sessions actually look like if you want to leave a comment below. Because, like I said, I definitely have run days with 6 encounters, but it is far from the norm and feels exhausting for everyone by the time it's done, so I'm genuinely curious how that works for your tables. My prevailing theory on why we see so few encounters today, one that I've mentioned in a few videos now, is largely down to the way that people are being introduced to the game. The advent of live streams like Critical Role, Dimension 20, and countless others have created a certain perception of the game. That being one that is much more narrative focused with more storytelling and communication, and leaving things like combat to be mere supporting elements and far from the focus. As a result, with the massive influx of players that 5th edition brought, and make no mistake, 5th edition is by far the most popular version of the game, and it isn't even close. People are being introduced to the game with the expectation that this is what a game of Dungeons & Dragons is supposed to look like. And the funny thing is, there's nothing to say that it isn't. These shows, Critical Role and the like, are just that. They're shows. They have incredible on-screen talents and are designed to get people engaged in watching as much as possible. And the reality is that well-crafted stories and worlds just do that better than combat does. Sure, a well-paced and climactic combat encounter can be absolutely breathtaking and memorable, but in many cases, it's less about the encounter itself and more about what brought it to that point, the context, what it represents. All of this circles us back to our original point of discussion, the adventuring day. The reality is, or at least seems to be, that most players are not running as many encounters as the design team expected when they were making the game, and that definitely has some impacts, so let's talk about those. Something I've talked about a lot on this channel is the martial caster divide. I've made entire videos on the topic, so I'm not going to get into detail here, but I'll leave a link in the end cards. The basic premise though is that spellcasting characters can effectively do everything that a martial character can do just as well, if not better than the martial character, which can result in them feeling a little bit useless in a wide array of situations. There's a lot more nuance to it than that though, so check out the videos if you want some more context. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make here is that character classes were created and balanced around the idea of players actually playing 6 to 8 medium to hard encounters per day. This means that things like availability of spell slots or other magical resources like sorcery points, channel divinity, bardic inspiration, and wild shape were likely intended to be much more thinly stretched across an adventuring day than they are in reality. Since most martial classes don't really have resources that were designed in this way, fighters can just keep on attacking, rogues can keep on sneak attacking, and rangers can keep on foraging. That's a joke. The natural gap between the two basic archetypes actually probably ends up smaller than what we see in play. Yes, martial classes were given some rest-dependent resources like Fighter's Action Surge and Second Wind, and even Monk with their key points, but these were short rest-dependent, which the design team were expecting you to have at least 2 of per day. It's almost like the team was conscious of the potential rift between archetypes and tried to find ways around it. Yes, arcane recovery exists, but we don't talk about wizards. I'm not going to say that if everyone ran 8 encounters per day that the problems would all be solved, but it probably would get pretty close. The point is though that shouldn't have to be the solution. People are clearly showing a preference for playing the game differently than intended, so it should evolve to meet us where we are, but more on that in just a little bit. This same idea is part of why something I mentioned in my UA 8 Barbarian video seems to be true. That being that rage as a resource has never really felt like an issue in 5e. This, again, is primarily down to the fact that if you're running 2 to 3 encounters per day, you basically are never worried about running out of rages. But if you were doubling or even quadrupling that amount, well, then that definitely might be a different story. The thing to me though, when I stop and think about the entire game really being designed around a 6 to 8 encounter adventuring day, I really do feel like many of the perceived balance issues that we talk about as a community would actually largely be solved. Yes, spellcasters would still be able to do everything that a fighter could do and better, but they might be more reluctant to do so knowing that they need to make their resources last for way longer. I also don't think that 5e would have the perception that it does for being easy either, but simultaneously, I'm not convinced that it would be for the better either. Hear me out. Like I mentioned earlier, I've run adventuring days for my group with 6 encounters, and while there is something really satisfying about it as you look around your table and see everyone kind of freaking out about managing their resources and figuring out how they're going to keep going, for me at least, it gets exhausting, and I know that my group mostly feels the same way too. I honestly wouldn't want to do that to them on a regular basis. And then there's the fact that it also becomes substantially more burdensome on the DM to plan and prepare and run and adjudicate just so many more things than they ordinarily would. So would the game be more balanced? Probably. But would it be more fun? I'm not so sure. At least not to me, and at least not all the time. Something of a happy medium that I would have loved to see in 1D&D, which we obviously aren't going to be getting, would have been a shift to something like having the game balanced around a 4 to 5 encounter adventuring day. This would shrink the available resource pool for those of us running 2 to 3 encounters per day, and create a little bit more tension while also making the quote-unquote full days a little bit less overwhelming to manage. I'm a really big proponent of growth and evolution. I've never subscribed to the idea that we should just keep doing something because it's just the way that we've always done it. We can and should learn from the past, but we shouldn't be beholden to it either. Every edition change brings swaths of people saying how D&D isn't the same anymore, it's not as good, it's too easy, and that very well might be the case from that individual's perspective. The reality is though that it also isn't the same anymore, and that's also kind of the point. The game has changed and evolved intentionally. It's by design. It wasn't an accident. You might not like the changes, and that's a completely valid perspective to hold, but it doesn't mean that others can't enjoy them. So no, I don't actually think we're all playing Dungeons & Dragons wrong. I think we're just playing differently. As far as I can tell, D&D has evolved to a place where people are looking for fewer encounters per day, but are also simultaneously craving a little bit tighter balance. I really do think that this can be achieved if the design team did what they have in years past and reevaluate their concept of the adventuring day, to allow us to continue to have meaningful campaigns, to meet the players where they are, rather than where they want them to be. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to help me reach that goal of 5,000 subs by the end of the month. Check out some of my other Dungeons & Dragons videos, but otherwise, take care.